My name is Stephen Young. I am an Associate Professor of Geography and International Studies here at UW-Madison. I'm also the Faculty Director for the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, or IRIS-NRC. And IRIS-NRC is the host for today's event. Our mission is to support and enhance global awareness and inspire informed thinking about the complexities of our world. And as such, we try to provide resources and expertise to K-12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. And you'll find a lot more information about our events as well as other resources at our website, irisnrc.wisc.edu. Thank you also to the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice and to the Department of Geography, who are co-sponsoring today's event. Essie Lenchner will be running the tech support today. If you have any challenges, please use the chat function to contact her. We'll be recording today's event and sharing the link and digital resources in a post-event email, but you'll only show up on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. Before we begin, I'd like to read the land acknowledgement. For UW-Madison, the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place that their nation has called Dejob since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state governments repeatedly, but unsuccessfully, sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. And today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker today, Professor Immanuel Ness, who is a professor of political science at Brooklyn University, City University of New York, and also visiting professor of sociology at the University of Johannesburg. Professor Ness has worked for many years as a trade union organizer in the US and as a labor activist in the Global South. He is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Labor and Society. He's been involved in numerous editing projects, including the Encyclopedia of American Social Movements and the Routledge Handbook of the Gig Economy, which was published earlier this year. And he's also the author and editor of numerous articles and books on labor, worker insurgencies, and trade unions. Most recently, he's published a book, Migration as Economic Imperialism, which I have here, which some of you will be receiving copies of. And in this book, which he's going to talk about today, what we see is really a sort of a deconstruction and unraveling of a really deeply embedded idea in a lot of development institutions and sort of mainstream conversations about how to reduce poverty and global economic inequalities through a reliance on international migration and the remittance networks that are linked to those migratory trends. So I'm going to hand over now and ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Immanuel Ness.
Thank you for that introduction, Professor Young. I really appreciate it. And I also am honored to be involved in the IRIS-NRC outreach program, which is extremely important because of the, I think, necessity for people to understand the major dynamics of the world today. And thank you for that introduction. I wrote this book. It's based on many years of research in countries of origin as well as countries of destination, which I'll explain to you, but throughout the world. And yes, I went to places to study workers and to study workplaces and various people who are involved in the migration process. And I just want to give you some of the background that, I would go to a place like Nepal, not to go to the Himalayas, but to go into the city of Kathmandu and to examine the major industries in that city and the major politically, the political economy that makes the city a vibrant city, which is unfortunate in some respects because that is the migrant industry. So, you go to a place like Madison, where I am right now. It's curious. I've been here before. The major centers of employment, I would say, would be the University of Wisconsin at Madison, as well as the state and the state services, and probably ancillary businesses related to high tech, and so forth. And I've actually spoken to people here in the past, people like Joel Rogers and so forth, about how to make the transformation from industrialization to a high tech economy that is relevant and creates prosperity. In a place like Kathmandu, there's probably one city light in this entire city of about 2 million people. The city is teeming with people. Most of the population is from migrant areas. Those areas are extremely poor, and by poor, I'm referring to the equivalent of about, well, it's changed over time, but in these regions, about $500 a year. So, figure about several dollars a day. And the workforce is primarily precarious, a term that is used by many scholars, incorrectly by some scholars, in my view, but correctly by others. I won't get into that unless you're interested. But precarious labor is primarily the labor of workers who make up the majority of the population of the world. And that population lives in Asia, it lives in Africa and Latin America. And it makes up about 80% of the world. So, some of you may know this already. So from the framework that what makes me so interested in the framework that I use is one in which I'm very interested in understanding the population and the labor dynamics. I'm very much interested in questions of inequality between countries as well as within countries, and poverty from the perspective of alleviating poverty. So to understand that, one really needs to know what the dynamics are going on within the political economy. I don't want to use complicated terms, so I want to make this as simple but also as meaningful as possible. We live in a world over the last, I would say, at least 30 to 40 years in which the state has sort of withdrawn from the economies, especially in countries like the United States and Western Europe, with certain exceptions, both temporal exceptions and spatial exceptions. And I can explain that as well. And that, if you take a look at the World Inequality Index, which is a index that's produced out of Paris, the Center for Economic Research in Paris. And the numbers are just stunning in terms of looking at the global population, where in fact the top 1% of the global population controls something like 30% of all wealth. The top 10% of the population may control something like 60%, and so forth and so on. And one can actually pattern that, across the global economy and within countries as well. And so why is migration a very important dynamic? I would argue, in fact, perhaps one of the most significant dynamics of our time, and which makes me think about the fact that I grew up in an era in the United States when people were on the move, or there was a highly mobile population, where many people did not live in the same place for a long period of time. And this seems to be increasingly the case as we move to new regions of the country, of the world, where people are not able to stay in the same location for extensive periods of time. So taking the Nepalese example, a country that has gone through a lot of tumultuous periods during the 1980s and 1990s, there was a unsuccessful revolution, a Maoist revolution, I would say highly unsuccessful, and in terms of its outcome. And the effort was to dislodge the power structure and to create a more equitable society, an equitable society within a country that's poor. So when we think about countries like Nepal with a GDP which has grown in the last several decades, and that growth has to do in part because of migration, but not to the extent that it's actually made it a developing country, but it's actually made it dependent on migration, as if it needs to feed off this system of migration in order to survive, which is what social scientists, people who study social sciences are very much interested when it comes to the world economy, the core and the periphery, and the periphery is highly dependent on what happens within the core regions of the world. So, I very much agree with those scholars and writers who argue that the world is a divided place, divided planet, a planet whose major division is on the basis of location. So I use social class in that context, in the sense that if you're a worker in Madison or Chicago, New York, you may be complaining about your wages. So there's a strike of the United Auto Workers right now where workers are demanding a 32-hour work week. If you go to the global south, people, they're demanding a 32-hour work week because they want fewer hours of work and higher wages. If you go to the global south, people are demanding work and don't find it. So there's a surplus of labor. And that surplus of labor allows and contributes to countries of the global north, but rich countries that are also in the south, to some, very few, but there are some, to have migration. So we start with production industries such as automobiles, electronics, and so forth, and we can go on to agriculture, construction, care industries, which women tend to dominate, as well as the new platform economy, which I work on in a number of places and studying. So when investigating these kinds of 5 industries, these are the 5 industries where migrants tend to inhabit. And in this context, I'm very much interested in understanding the differences amongst migrants and where they go. So the dominant thinking in migration is that migration is a form of development. And migration being a form of development means just that. It replaces everything else to become the most important aspect of development in poor countries. Now, of course, the United States, France, Britain, Japan, and other countries around the world have migrants as well. And so the vast majority of migrants are workers who are poor, who cross boundaries through temporary migration programs that are established bilaterally, as well as through crossing borders and becoming undocumented workers, and make a very clear case that there really isn't much of a difference between the two. primarily because many temporary workers become undocumented. And I won't get into that in a moment because I wanted to focus on the most important aspects of this because we have limited time. And so let me just share screen for a moment and give you a certain sense of what this means. So here is a chart figure, as we call it, that distinguishes between low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and high-income countries. And one of the most interesting aspects of this is that high-income countries and upper middle-income countries dominate migration. So most migrants, most exchange of money is not really money that's exchanged between poor and rich countries because of migration. It's money that's exchanged between rich countries and rich countries, as well as rich countries and relatively rich countries. And what this means is that we have, precisely what I was talking about before, what I would call a form of unequal exchange. So what is so alarming for me is that the major financial institutions, the multilateral development agencies who are seeking to develop countries in the global south are doing so for the, here's the figure 0.1, are doing so for the putative reason that this is going to be a development process, that this is going to contribute to prosperity for many countries. But the reality of it is that, of course, migration improves people's lifestyles, potentially. There are examples of that where, a family member may migrate to a country in order to educate their children, to provide private education or even state education to their children, which gives them an advantage and improves their ability to earn in the future. It's also true, that it contributes to maybe families building a new wing on their home. Less so does it contribute to business development. In fact, this is a very big issue throughout the world, that migration does not, as a development function, contribute to the improvement of people's the societal prosperity, education, housing, healthcare, sanitation even, and transportation, and on and on and on. So, if we examine those countries which have the highest levels of migration, the low wage migration, they tend to be amongst the poorest of the world. Now, this perspective is one that could be challenged by some, but in terms of the fact that it's true that those people who are better off tend to migrate because they have higher levels of skill and so forth, even from poor countries. Yet at the same time, there's almost no evidence that it contributes to development of a country. So no new infrastructure, no new development whatsoever, which raises questions in today's world when we have a planet that's becoming hotter and hotter, and where you have migration that in some instances is based on climate change due to major storms, which usually occur in the countries of what should be called the global south. So for instance, in Kerala in South India, which is a state that, very large state in population. India is the largest country of the world, as we all know. This year it eclipsed China as the largest country. That in Kerala, tens of thousands of migrants, tea workers, had to leave the country and work in the Gulf Cooperation Council states, the Arab Gulf. So that includes Saudi Arabia. I can show it to you on a map if you'd like. Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and so I mentioned Saudi Arabia already, and I think it includes Oman too. And so they go and work there, and they work there under very hazardous conditions. So one of the dominant themes of workers who come from South Asia to the Gulf Cooperation Council states or the Arab Gulf states is that they tend to be low-wage workers who are employed in engineering. No, forgive me, I'm sorry. We tend to be employed in low-wage jobs. So they work with people's families. They may work in construction. That's where I was thinking. So why construction? This past year, was the year before last, we had the World Cup. Or no, it was this year. We had the World Cup, and Qatar came last winter in the global north of winter. Qatar came under a lot of criticism because of the way they treated the migrant laborers there. So a country like Qatar has a population of, roughly speaking, I'm going to be maybe 500,000 people. That's being generous, and yet its real population is, if you include migrants, is about 6-7 times as much. So there are, maybe 5 million. So that would actually be 10 times more, about 5 million people living there. Better example, United Arab Emirates, which is a little bit larger. It has about 2 million to 3 million people who are residents and have cradle to grave benefits, will make use of migrants who do not have a right to become citizens at any point in any of these states. And the population of the UAE is about 13 to 15 million people. So roughly speaking, again, about a ratio of 1 to 8, you have the citizens, which make up, a very small proportion of these countries. And these countries rely on construction workers. They rely on care workers. They rely on platform labor workers, people deliver and ride-hailing services and so forth and so on. UAE has Dubai. Many of you have heard of it. And so in that context, all the workers are migrant workers, just about all the workers. I would argue, and this is based on the data that I've collected, both mixed methods data, that those people who work there, and the particular populations that are recruited from Africa as well as South Asia and Southeast Asia, work there for a discrete period of time, maybe 3 years. They work on the basis of bilateral labor agreements, and they make very little money. Low-wage temporary workers do not make, by definition, don't make a lot of money because they're low-wage workers. Many of them are young, in the prime of their life. In my definition for being in one's prime, well, you can be in your prime at any time in some respects, but the time of life where people become adults, 18 to 25 to 30. And I'm stretching it by saying 30 because by the time many people reach the age of 30, they become redundant, which means unemployed and unemployable and not desired. So in many locations, and you'll note that I'm giving you examples of destination states in the global South. I'll give you one example in Malaysia, which is a very interesting and complex state, to say the least, probably amongst the most complex in terms of its economy. It's got a population of about 28 to 30 million people. It has a very large land mass. I can show it to you on a map. Does everyone here know where Malaysia is? So I'll show it to you on a map. Okay, so I have to share screen first, so sorry about that. Sharing screen. I'm using Google Maps because they're used ubiquitously. And so this is Malaysia. Here's India, Bangladesh, Pakistan. This is considered South Asia, India, and the former British Raj. But the British Raj extended to what is called Myanmar today. And Malaysia was also controlled by the British. This is the country of Malaysia, what is called Penang Peninsula, where you have much of the manufacturing going on. And this region, which is Borneo. And you can see the geographic borders by this line here, which is Borneo, and this country here is a very rich oil state, which is not part of it. But this region of Malaysia produces a lot of oil and produces a lot of agricultural products that are sold throughout the world. So here's the very strange aspect about Malaysia. Malaysia has a population, a resident population, people who call themselves citizens, of about 28 to 30 million. However, about 80% of the workforce, and maybe up to 90% of the manufacturing workforce, are migrant workers. Now, why is that the case? We can ask ourselves, well, why is that the case from a political economy perspective? And I visited Malaysia a number of times, just to confirm, and I've gone to Borneo and Sarawak. And the reason is because of discrimination, bluntly discrimination. There is a discrimination that exists in Malaysia against Malayan people by the dominant population. Of course, there are people who of mixed backgrounds. So there may be the two major groups are Indians and Chinese, which make up a minority of the population. Some 22 to 25 million of the population is Malayan, and there are many wars of independence. In fact, there was a women's war of independence that took place in the 1960s, a very interesting one. It has had a lot of communal violence and so forth, and the Malayan population, which is indigenous to the area, is largely excluded from most of the economic benefits of the state. And so up until like 5 years ago, the tallest buildings in the world were in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, and Petronas Towers. They're two big, really tall buildings. They make anything in the United States. They dwarf buildings in the United States. And they're based on the oil company and so forth. But the major export of Malaysia is electronics and semiconductors and so forth. So what Malaysia is, so why is Malaysia so important to the global economy, is that it is crucial for global supply chains. So many products that we get, our computers that we're using right now, probably most of them have parts that are made in Malaysia. That's not true for iPhones, but many phones too may have electronic parts, semiconductor, various different types of parts that are actually fabricated in Malaysia by foreign workers. Now, who are those foreign workers, we should ask ourselves? Well, those foreign workers actually come from the region. So when I say region, so we'll just pan out more. The Southeast Asia is anywhere from Myanmar to Vietnam, and I would say all of Indonesia, as well as Papua New Guinea, although some people call it part of Australasia and so forth, but it's really culturally more part of Southeast Asia, because as you can see, if I pan in, here's Singapore right here, crucial port, that this is Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. And actually the population here, which is a poor country, it's the, did I say fourth largest country in the world? So the largest country in the world is India, China, United States, and then Indonesia. And the population is, for the most part, poor and highly reliant on migration. So there has been many books written and articles written, including myself. I've written articles on migrant women who work as domestics throughout the world, from Indonesia, as well as from the Philippines. I forgot to mention the Philippines as being part of Southeast Asia. Why did I do that? Because the Philippines has a very different history, and yet they're probably one of the leading countries of migration, out migration, and they produce services primarily, as opposed to manufacturing goods. So you might have Indonesian workers going to Malaysia, producing electronics, etc. And you have Indonesian workers going to major cities such as Kuala Lumpur, but more importantly, cities such as Singapore and this autonomous region of China, Hong Kong, which is probably the richest city in the world in terms of wealth, absolute wealth. And so Indonesian and Filipino workers go there, about 600,000 to 700,000 in all. Now, so what is the population of Hong Kong? I usually use New York as the comparison because I live in New York. New York has a population now, it's actually grown to 8.4 million people. The population of Hong Kong is about 7 million people, just over. And so that means that one out of every, or almost 1 out of every 10 people is a migrant domestic worker living in other people's homes, providing care services for children, cleaning services, providing a whole range of services for middle-class women and men to be able to make money and to make a lot more money. So, so I frequently ask, if I go to Hong Kong, I speak to both populations, because most people in Hong Kong actually speak Chinese, but many speak English, and you have that opportunity. I speak very little Chinese. You have the opportunity to speak to the Indonesian and Filipino workers there. They're from 18 to 24, 25 years old, and then they're sent back home. And so I calculated this, and it was corroborated by a number of state officials, as well as experts, that about 1 of every 4 families has domestic workers from abroad. Just to give you an example of the way this is Hong Kong, it's even more true in a place like Singapore. And it's very true in a city that has become rich in the last number of years, Kuala Lumpur. But it's also, if we pan across the globe, the south, this is the Arab Gulf region, also known as the Persian Gulf, as you'll see. It's competitive because it depends on whether you're Iranian or you consider yourself Arab. So, and here's Dubai, which is not a necessarily big city, but it's a very affluent place. And this is called the Gulf Cooperation Council States. So I wanted to say one thing. So with respect to service workers, I was very much interested in manufacturing workers, but also service workers. With respect to service workers, one of the main historic forms of migration was amongst healthcare workers. So the Philippines developed its economy. Now you know where it is in the map. You probably know already. But it's always good to look at a map just to confirm that they have an industry that is completely directed at providing nurses and healthcare workers as well as domestics, as well as shipping workers if you're male. So you work on ships for other countries. So these workers are trained by the state of the Philippines, and they work abroad, and the Philippines does not really benefit at all. But an even better example would be a country in a region of Africa known as the Sahel, which it's actually one of the few British countries. It's called Ghana. I won't show it to you on the map for the moment, but it's northwestern Africa. And Ghana is a major producer of migrants to Britain, and those migrants happen to be nurses. So if you calculate how much it costs to educate a nurse in Ghana, about 60,000 US dollars. It's probably gone up since over the last 3 years, but around $60,000. And so there are thousands of them that go to Britain, and they're excellent workers there. I mean, they're excellent nurses. They're trained in all the basics. Many of us know that nurses sometimes save lives more than doctors do, because they're, watching people all the time, and they know a lot about care. So they generally do not give money back home. They don't send money back home, but the idea is to, be able to survive in their new country, which will be Britain. And that's actually something new when we take a look at the idea of women and women workers. Globally speaking, and I can also show you some other slides, globally speaking, women make up about 50% of all migrant workers. That is a significant shift that has taken place over the last 50 years under a period that we call, I mentioned earlier, neoliberalism, where free markets reign. In the past, it used to be, unless people traveled as families, it used to be men who were the migrants. But now it's about an equal number of both. And you have women migrant workers who are employed in all those 5 categories I mentioned: agriculture, construction to a lesser extent, manufacturing, absolutely, care services, especially, as well as the gig economy. And they go to places that are primarily destination states in the global north. What do I mean by the global north? I'm talking about those states that are wealthy, that represent about 10% to 15%, maybe, or more, but around there, of the world population. They're known as countries that are part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And so some examples would be the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, Japan, Korea, and a few other states. Depends on what their GDP per capita is. So many migrants travel to these countries. Of course, every region has a different dynamic of migration. I'm just going a little bit off topic. There are 3 major corridors of migration. One is Southeast Asia, which is essentially a corridor where people travel back and forth within the region. The other is actually, ironically, it's called the Schengen zone in Europe. It's made up of about 27 countries, mostly of the European Union. Britain no longer is in that, as we know, and that population is able to go from any country to any other country. So after Brexit, which you all know, the British leaving the European Union, a lot of people who were in Britain were very scared because they thought they'd be deported. And so I don't think they've really gone that far, because these were highly skilled workers in many instances, but many others were deported. The population that went to Britain tended to be from Poland, Romania, working in agricultural fields, and so forth and so on. So what that did for Europe, again, I won't show you the map, is that the Schengen zone developed in, circa 2000, just after 2003, 2004. Schengen is the spelling of it. And it contributed to a new migration regime within Europe. It meant that anybody from any other country in the Schengen zone could settle in another country and live there permanently. However, what it did was it excluded people from the Western Asia, which was at one time called the Middle East, Africa, and other places where you had most of the migrants coming in the preceding years. So migration was primarily between continents, and it shifted around 20 years ago to an internal migration. But that doesn't mean that there's no more migrants that are coming from Africa and Southwestern Asia or Western Asia. So for instance, in 2015, there was a mass wave of migrants, about 1.5 to 2 million migrants from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and a few other states in West Asia to Europe, because of wars that were caused by other states in some respects, but that's something probably that may be too contentious. But was caused by, the war in Iraq was caused by the United States. That's not contentious whatsoever, although I once had a class where it was. The United States invaded Iraq in 2003. And the United States also invaded Afghanistan in 2002. Make no mistake about it. Syria also is a more complex place, so I won't get into it. So you have these populations that are refugees, but they're also workers. They leave. They tend to live in their destination countries permanently. It created a furor in Europe right before Brexit. And it shows you, it demonstrates a very important dynamic of migration, and that is xenophobia, or intolerance toward others. Many countries of Europe, don't allow foreigners, especially foreigners from Asia and Africa, into their countries whatsoever. So again, getting back to the book, the main argument of the book is that because labor is so cheap, I'll just put it this way, because the value that is given to labor, accorded labor, is much lower in the global South, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, etc., that those workers are in high demand in places like the United States, North America, Canada, as well as Europe and parts of East Asia. So that's the principal form of migration. People who go from countries such as El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, to Mexico and primarily the United States. Currently, in the city where I live and state, there's a large wave of Venezuelan migrants that are coming there because of poverty in Venezuela, ironically caused by sanctions, which is another topic that maybe you'll encounter. But sanctions are economic measures that block states from trading. So the economy regresses over a period of time. The gross domestic product declines and so forth. And so the initial population that leaves tend to be more wealthy, and then you have populations that leave for other regional countries. So they went to Ecuador, Colombia, and other states, and now increasingly to the United States. Okay, so I'll just make this argument that they're very highly beneficial to the economy, and there's a terminology that is used by scholars, and that's called crisis, which I don't use, and an honest migration scholar should not use, because the crisis is not a crisis that's taking place in the United States or Europe. Certainly there are some costs that are involved, but the crisis are the people who are leaving these countries who can't survive. But it's contributed to intolerance, what we call xenophobia, throughout Europe and throughout the United States, and even Canada, certainly Canada. Even if these workers are necessary workers. So, one of the contradictions is that here you have perhaps amongst the most important workers, essential workers, especially during the COVID era. These were the workers who were doing the most dangerous jobs in protecting Americans as well as Europeans and others, and yet they are considered to be persona non grata, and so they're deportable. So as I would put it, they're subject to arrest, they're subject to imprisonment, and then they're deported. And ironically, I hate to say this, Barack Obama deported more people than any other president in recent memory from this country. So I think there's a bipartisan, both parties are interested in deporting. Following the populism and so forth, they both want to deport, although it's more complicated than that, because there is some interest in having a migration accord in the United States. There hasn't been any migration law of significance that was passed since 1986, and the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which absorbed some of the immigrant population, but certainly not all. And so you have people who have been living here for 50 years or more who remain stateless, so to speak. Yeah, so I mean, they can go back to their home country, but their lives have been lived here. I mean, they've lived most of their lives here. And it's specifically tragic when it involves children who become adults and so forth. And so that we think of the dreamers and so forth. The book makes a lot of arguments, but the key argument is one in which the focal point is that migration is not a form of development. It may improve to some extent the lives of families back in the home country, but it also could hurt most of the population in those home countries if it transforms the economies into ones that are fully dependent or mostly dependent on migration. Because what happened, we have crises that take place, 2008, 2009, great financial recession being one of them. The coronavirus pandemic, where many migrants were deported, especially women, without being paid. So, we in this country talk about wage theft for US citizens or US populations, but there has been international wage theft, in the, I would say, billions of dollars. So, I mean, I could go on, but I wanted to direct this presentation to to you, to the people who are here. And I don't know what's next, if there are any questions or concerns that people might have. I have a lot of slides, but I hope the argument is recognized, and you may want to disagree with me, which is, I think, part of learning. So
thank you so much, Professor Ness. We have a few minutes to collect a couple of questions. So if you do have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it yourself, or you can put something in the chat, and I'll read out your question. Does anybody have a question to ask?
yeah, I'm open to it. In fact, it would be great if people were to ask questions, because, like I said, we both learn, and no one should feel that you may know more than I do. So that's what I want to say.
Essie has a question. The first of which, well, yes, what are the policy implications of the work that you've shared today? So how does this, and I know that you'll be giving lots of talks about this, to the extent that, that is reaching a policy audience, how would you translate that for those that kind of audience? And secondly, hypothetically, if borders were closed in every country and migration flows stopped, how would it impact the global economy? And I know that you write in the book about these sort of shifting migratory regimes, and how the selective tightening of borders at particular moments of crisis is connected to this as well. But if you'd like to speak a little to that.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. Also one that's challenging. So I see, I want to, kind of ruminate very briefly. But what I would say is that starting, and this is in the book too, that over the last 30 years or so, there has been an attempt to create a global migration regime. By regime, I'm talking about a compact, and it's referred to as the Global Compact on Migration. 2019, only 4 years ago, a global compact on migration was achieved, where virtually every country in the world, except for 6 countries, 7, 8 maybe, signed on to an agreement where they would recognize the rights of migrants and so forth, and they would be able to cross borders and so forth, and work. But that's the policy, but it's never been put into practice. This is right at the time, just after 2017, 2019, 2017 were the negotiations, 2019 they were concluded, and it was very convenient for at the time President Trump to say, I'm not going to follow that agreement whatsoever. We're a sovereign country. This breaks our sovereignty completely. Why should we be beholden to the international order, the UN? And in terms of the hypothetical, so I'm giving you policy implications on a global level, where there should be certain protections that migrants have. They shouldn't be exploited. They should have rights to specific wages, the same wages that are paid to other workers in that sector of the economy, and on and on. And women should not be exploited, and they should have higher rights. Women play a very important part in this whole question, because they tend to be more exploited in so many different ways. So with respect to the question, if all borders were closed in every country and migration stopped, would the global economy be impacted? The question would be, the answer to that question is absolutely. I think it would almost grind to a halt. Let me just give you an example to that. There are about 200 million migrants, temporary or undocumented migrants in the world, maybe more, but I'm just giving you a rough figure. That is people will say, well, that's 200 million people, but they have families, so maybe they're nuclear and extended families, so that impacts billions of people, or at least over a billion people. And if those populations are no longer working in places like the United States or Europe, Canada, essential services such as healthcare would not be available. So if you were going to look at the population, well, let's just say, for example, Norway, I'm just giving you an estimate, about 15% of the population are migrant workers. 15%. And that's true of virtually every country in Europe. In the United States, it's even more. So if you're going to, stop this migration, however that would take place, it would have severe implications on that sector, and we can certainly say that would be true with respect to construction, because today most construction workers in the United States are migrant workers, and we can say that for the platform economy. I think everyone here knows what that is. It's ride hailing would be an example of it. It's the use of platforms for workers to deliver things and so forth, but also conduct work in different ways. So you pay through the phone and so forth. So that would come to an end to a large extent, because these jobs are not necessarily or at all desirable. And one of the most important areas where migrants are engaged is agriculture. So I would pretty much say that in the United States, they would not, a lot of crops would not be harvested, like apples, orange. Oh, to the degree there are oranges, yeah, they wouldn't be harvested. Who would harvest them? Or they wouldn't be cared for, and so forth. So this just goes to show you, and thank you very much for that question, how dependent the rich destination states are. That's also true for manufacturing industries increasingly, although we do have global supply chains that have an important impact. I think there's another question from Sandra.
Go right ahead.
So Sandra is asking, why is it that expatriates are usually not part of the migration discussions? That's a very good question. Because if you're an expatriate, you're already a citizen of the destination state, no? And if you're a citizen, it's a moot question. These are only questions about, what passports you hold. So if you're from, I'll give you an example. I just want to say an example. If you're from, because some countries do not allow dual citizenship, like China, Germany, and a couple other, Germany increasingly, but so let's say you're from a country like Spain, or you're from a country like Italy, and you migrate to the United States. You're a dual citizen, and you can go back and forth. These people, I actually know somebody who actually collects passports. I won't mention the person's name. He's got a passport from Germany because his family were migrants from Italy in the 1950s and 60s after the war. He's got a passport from 60s, I think. He's got a passport, and that was hard to earn, from Mexico, because he did studies there, and he actually works there. He's got a passport from Venezuela, and he's got a US passport because his ex-wife and child live here. I mean, all these countries allow dual citizenship. So Sandra, I'd say that expats are part of, they are migrants because they've left their home country and so forth. But for the most part, but not all, they're integrated within society. They are more welcomed in some respect. They may win the lottery to come to the United States. The United States has specific policies as to other countries as to which migrants they want and which migrants they don't want, and permanently. So, but you're right, they should be part of the discussion because they, I can give examples such as Indian expatriates that with dual citizenship, and they go back and forth. They're part of the discussion, to use your language. So in this case, you have people who are in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, highly skilled workers from India who come to the United States. They're also privileged and work on specific visas. These are kind of exception to the rule. And they come to other countries, go to other countries as well. They come under specific visas, and they go back and forth. And at some point, they gain citizenship because they have sponsors in this country, employer sponsors. Essentially, the point would be, I was talking about immigration law with respect to the United States, but also other countries with certain exceptions where they don't want migrants, is that if you're going to contribute to the country's economy, well, then that's okay. But, I think poor people or low-wage migrants do as well. So it's actually a very interesting point that you're making, and that is that essentially you're buying your right to become an expat because you have skills. And if you read migration labor law, so I do, because you won't be a burden on the state itself. You see? So those are some of the reasons. But they're part of the discussion. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, diversity is a great thing for various countries, the United States included.
I'm conscious that we're getting close to time here, Professor Ness. I wanted to ask one last question, which is from the vantage point of your sort of involvement in labor organizing as well, and thinking about worker movements, which is, as you were talking about the Qatar example and migration from the south of India, it reminded me we had a talk just before the World Cup by Natasha Iskander, who's a sociologist who's written about the migrant workers. And, one of the images she had was of these workers suspended from a stadium that they're helping to construct, and someone's from Nepal, someone's from Kerala, someone's from Nigeria, and the sort of, it's amazing that they were able to sort of cooperate and care for one another in these brutal conditions, but clearly that's also a barrier to organizing and pushing for some of these changes. So in your experience of sort of working in that sort of labor organizing field, how do you feel about that kind of work right now in terms of trying to address this?
Well, that's a very good question, and I've studied this, Stephen. The problem, they have solidarity, right? They work together. They sometimes eat together. Their entire lives are integrated in the process of building those sports structures and so forth. But the one problem is that they can't stay there. And so that solidarity, which they build up, which is so important, cannot be, and this is true for almost all temporary migrants. They can't maintain that solidarity unless they're able to stay for a long period of time. This is also true for Korea, which has very, actually one of the best migration policies in the world, because they tend not to be xenophobic. Of course, there's always xenophobic people anywhere, but they have, people from many different countries entering with a time clock, which may be 3 years or 5 years, depending on the job or something like that. So I knew a number of workers in the auto industry, interviewed them, in fact, who were leaders in organizing, and yet they had to go back home to their home country. And that's sort of sad, in terms of, they established a life in some respects in the destination state that actually treats their workers better than most, if not all. And yet they still have to, they're members of the union, the KCTU, or in this case, the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions and their automobile division, welcome them. Even in the United States, there's some unions, for high-skilled workers, teachers, nurses, and so forth. They have to get paid the same wages. And sometimes in the United States, people tend to stay because they're important to the economy, but not auto workers. And certainly not construction workers who are highly mistreated. So yeah, that's a very important point. I actually know Natasha Iskander. She teaches at NYU, unless I've met her a number of times, and she has written extensively on this topic, and it's very important to recognize the ways in which solidarity is built up, but it also cannot be long-lasting for that very reason. It's temporary migration and temporary solidarity, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect way to put it. Well, thank you so much for writing this book, for talking to us about it today. We're at time here, but we've learned a lot, and we're pleased that you were able to join us and allow us to record the event. And please join me in thanking Professor Immanuel Ness for the talk.